3 of his works have been finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. He, of course, won the Tony Award for Best Play for M. Butterfly, his seminal work, and remains the first and only Asian American playwright to have won that. Is that correct?
Yeah, kind of sad but true.
Yeah, that speaks to, I think, more structural issues. And yeah, so David has a slew of other greatly deserved awards, honors, and recognitions, which I won't bore you by rattling off here. A prolific, expansive canon of plays, including FOB, Rich Relations, Face Value, Golden Child, Bangkok, Yellowface, Chinglish, which is one of my favorite plays. Obviously, and Butterfly also is the book writer and librettist for multiple musicals and operettas and operas, including Aida, your richly reimagined revival of Flower Drum Song, your recent collaboration with Janine Tesori on the phenomenal Soft Power, which I'm really excited to talk to you about. And also a screenwriter, you obviously adapted M. Butterfly as a film yourself, but you also more recently have been and consultant producer on several seasons of the excellent, critically acclaimed show, The Affair. So there you go. That's a long list. But I wanted to actually start, because this is a series for NIDA, and so a lot of the viewership will be students and theater educators. And I obviously met you while I was a student. I wanted to start with your time as a student at Stanford. And I wanted to ask you, how you went from doing a BA in English to sort of getting yourself a theater education and writing plays.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's one of my great credits that I got to teach at Columbia when you were at Columbia, and it's like, well, who do you want to brag about? Oh, I want to brag about Felicia. So that's really exciting. And okay, so I went to college at Stanford, and I didn't know what I was going to do when I went there. I just knew I wasn't going to be a doctor or engineer or something like that because I'm not good at math or any of that stuff. And when I was a freshman, we went up and saw some plays in San Francisco at American Conservatory Theater. And I think I saw Thornton Wilder's The Matchmaker and a production of Winter's Tale. And I started to think, oh, maybe I can do this. So I started writing plays in my spare time. Stanford at that point didn't have any playwriting classes. So I found a professor who was teaching a contemporary drama class and also ran the creative writing department, a poet novelist named John Leroux. And John looked at my plays and he told me they were bad, which they were. And that my problem was that I wanted to write plays, but I didn't actually know anything about the theater. But John was also a good guy and helped me to design a playwriting major within the creative writing department. And that was how I saw as many plays and read as many plays as I could, and that's how I got my education. The summer before my senior year, I had the opportunity to study with Sam Shepard and Maria Irene Fornez, and they taught me more to write from my subconscious. And once I did that, I found some of these themes that I didn't know I was interested in starting to appear on the page, like immigration, assimilation, racism. And I wrote my first play, FOB, or Fresh Off the Boat, to be done in my dorm the following year. And then 14 months later, through a variety of fortuitous circumstances, it ended up opening off Broadway at the Public Theater in New York, and that's how I started having a career.
Right. So, I assume that FOB landed its way on Joseph Papp's desk somehow, and that's how he started producing your plays at the public. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I think this is an example of a confluence of art and community activism, because around the time that I was doing my play in my dorm, the Public Theater did a play where a white activist cast in an Asian role. And this led to the first, I'm pretty sure, the first Yellowface protests in New York theater history, where the Asian actors of that day, who were not very powerful and few in number, protested outside the Public Theater. And Joe Papp, who the founder of the Public, because his mission was to create a theater that looked like New York, as he put it, he invited the protesters into his office and ended hiring one of them onto his staff with a brief to find plays for Asian actors. And it was just about that time that my play came across their desk. So I've always considered myself the beneficiary of affirmative action, because affirmative action identifies a social need and then creates a program to deal with it, which is basically what Joe did. And the door opened and I was the person who got to walk in.
Wow, it's incredible. Really speaks to what Joseph Papp's like values for that theater were, and the part of the DNA of the institution that is the public, which it's interesting to me that like he identified the social need, and so you sort of like got brought in to fill you were doing box ticking essentially, but it kind of like whole career.
Yes.
And he produced like your first 4 plays at the public?
Yeah, so FOB opened at the public. It did well. We won the OBIE Award for Best New Play that year. And Joe then told me he would produce anything I wrote, which I have subsequently learned is something that, it's not like he said that to everybody, but if he was really interested in a writer, they were generally young, predominantly male. He would become sort of like a surrogate father figure, and he was like a serial father figure. So and I fell into that category, and I got to have an experience in my early 20s that, you know, nobody gets to have, which is to be part of what I think is fair to say was the most exciting theater in America or the world at that time.
Yeah, that's incredible. What do you feel like you learned about yourself as a playwright through those sort of first 4 plays that you were doing at the public?
Well, initially, because of studying with Sam and Irene, I realized I was interested in, you know, what we now call Asian American subject matter. But I also learned to filter criticism, because the other part of my first meeting with Joe was that, you know, we did a reading of this play, FOB. Joe took me into his office. I was 21, I think, and he was Joe Papp. So of course I wanted him to like me, but he gave me some notes that I didn't really agree with. And he said, okay, you know, go and write out the draft and I'll decide if I'm going to do it or not. And of course, I had enough good sense not to say that I disagreed with his notes, but I also then went back to the San Francisco Bay Area and waited about 3 weeks and then sent him back the exact same script. And 10 days later, the phone rang and it was Joe Papp. And he was like, okay, the play's great, now we're going to do it. So, yeah, which is not to say, I think it's really important to listen to notes. And you know that I believe in rewriting, but it's also important to figure out like what notes speak to you and what don't. And ultimately, it's still your work and you have to hold on to your vision and you have to do what your heart tells you is right. And that's, you know, another important thing I learned through those early years at the public.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And also is something that I think you continue to kind of teach your playwriting students is how to, I think you once said it's like not listening to the note, but listen to what the note is pointing to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, oftentimes the note itself is not right per se, but the note suggests a problem that does need to be addressed. And as the writer creator, you know, you most likely can come up with a better solution. So I, as you know, say this to my own student, which is like, you know, if something I say, if I give you a note and it doesn't resonate with you, just ignore it, because, you know, which is, I guess, what I did with Joe's notes.
Yeah, but it's still pretty ballsy to like send the same script back to Joe Papp with no changes. Does he know? I'm sure retroactively he knew that that's what you had done.
You know, I don't know that a lot of times when people give notes, they're just sort of shooting from the hip, and they may or may not remember the specific notes. Probably if you're dealing with like a literary manager, nowadays they take their own notes, so then you can't get away with that. Yeah. But I have talked to Gail, Joe's widow, about she knows the story, and I've told it to her, and she said, you really understood Joe, which I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it was great.
Oh, that's amazing. On the subject of rewriting, I wanted to skip ahead to M. Butterfly, because I have a very vivid memory of being at school with you when you were working on rewrites for the Broadway revival of M. Butterfly, and how generous it was that you were like bringing in your students to talk about your process of rewriting that play, but also how incredibly brave it was for you to be taking this play, which is arguably your best known work that won a Tony for Best Play, and rewrite it. So I wanted to know, like, what made you think, like a couple of decades later, I want to like go back into this play. Oh, actually, before we talk about that, I do want to give like a brief synopsis of the play for people who might not be familiar with it. So it's based on kind of real historical event about a French diplomat who in the play is called René Gallimard, who becomes infatuated with a Peking opera performer, Song Li-ling. And sort of unbeknownst to him, they engage in a multi-year affair where Song Li-ling is spying on him for the Chinese government, but also he remains willfully ignorant, I would say, of the fact that Song Li-ling is actually a man. And the play also really explores Puccini's Madama Butterfly and is really entwined with the plot of that and the innate Orientalism of that opera. So yeah, I'd love to know, like, why you decided in 2016 to go back and revisit it.
Yeah, so for the revival, which I worked on with Julie Taymor directing, so it's been 30 years since the original production, and the way we think about gender has changed a lot in 30 years. And the original M. Butterfly seemed quite kind of gender binary in its worldview. In a lot of ways, the play is structured to turn on the sort of gotcha reveal that, we fooled the audience into thinking that this character, Song Li-ling, is a woman, and then, we fooled you the same way that the spy fooled the French diplomat, and in fact, it's a guy. And it's the same kind of device that got used in The Crying Game. And there's a whole story about the relationship between The Crying Game and M. Butterfly that I don't think we need to go into right now. But anyway.
But I actually really do want to go into that, but continue.
Okay. But we'll see if we have time. But, and so, and I feel like the way we think about gender now is, more nuanced. There's more of a spectrum. And I kind of wanted to grapple with that in this new version, as well as the fact that the old version is very much seen through Gallimard's lens. And that's fine, but I wanted to kind of elevate the Chinese spy's point of view as well. So, the new version, the Broadway revival wasn't nearly as successful as the original version, but I actually think the script is better. And I'm happy with the rewrites that I did. And I think the rewritten version will become more relevant and be more embraced because it is forward connecting in terms of the current discussions on gender and the way that that is all evolving.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What was your collaboration with Julie Taymor like on that? Because it was such a sort of incredibly spectacular production in a very Julie Taymor way.
Yeah, I mean, and the original was, spectacular as well, that John Dexter directed it and Eiko Ishioka designed. I think that play lends itself to a certain amount of spectacle and manifestation of the Orientalism, particularly because we are seeing events largely through the French diplomat's lens.
Right.
Yeah, I had a great time working with Julie, and she has that eye, of course. And she's also very attuned to story. I mean, Julie sometimes gets a rap for, oh, she's all spectacle. But that was not my experience of working with her, and she was a big part of the rewrite also.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think she does sort of get a reputation for being all spectacle, but she actually has very keen sort of dramaturgical insight into all of those texts that she adapts. I also wanted to ask you about the process of adapting it as a screenplay, and working with Cronenberg on it. Like, yeah, at what point did someone approach you and be like, we want to make a movie of this? And then how did you find the process of adapting it?
I mean, I think there was once the initial show was successful on Broadway, it was pretty clear that there's going to be movie interest. And so David Geffen had co-produced the original Broadway show. And so he had last right of refusal on the movie rights. And so Geffen decided he wanted to do the picture. Okay, so now I'll tell the crying game story.
Okay.
Which is, so I was interested initially in having Neil Jordan direct the M. Butterfly movie. And we had a meeting in London that Eiko Ishioka set up, and we got along well, and we were talking about things we were working on, and he was like, I'm working on an IRA movie, except it didn't have the gender twist at that point. And then I was like, yeah, well, you should do the M. Butterfly movie. So then I went back to the States, and Geffen at that point didn't want to hire Neil Jordan because he hadn't had a hit at that moment since Mona Lisa, which was ironic because they ended up making a lot of movies together. Then The Crying Game gets made with the gender twist. And Eiko Ishioka asked Neil Jordan, did you put that in because of M. Butterfly? And according to Eiko, he said, well, no, Eiko said he didn't say yes, but he didn't say no.
Oh my God! The Crying
Game came out before the Crying Game movie came out before the M. Butterfly movie. But anyway, it's not a copyrightable idea. So yeah, and then David Cronenberg had been wanting to do something else with Jeremy Irons. They'd just done Dead Ringers, the twin gynecologist movie. And our agency sent David M. Butterfly, and he wanted to do it. And, it's different, of course, making a movie, because the movie is primarily a directorial, the director is a primary artist. So David did the movie that he needed to do, which I think is exactly right. And he would say, and did say at the time, they wanted to make a movie about how all romantic love is self-delusion, which is a perfectly good Cronenbergian theme.
Yeah.
And I think the play is about that, but it's about other things. So I like the movie, but I like the play better.
Okay, that's very interesting. Did Cronenberg like intervene in the screenplay in any substantial way? Was there stuff about the play that he was like, I want to excise this?
Well, no. I mean, I had written a huge kind of epic screenplay, and David said it, wasn't unhappy with it, except he said it would cost $300 million to make. So he gave me some notes. I did a smaller version, which he liked. And then, once you go into shooting a movie, I wasn't on set, and I certainly wasn't in the editing room. So there were a lot of things that got removed, but it's not like he had to ask me.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting. I actually, in doing research for this, realized that you wrote the libretto for the opera version of The Fly. How did that happen?
Yeah, so many years later, David did his take on my story, and many years later, I did my take on his story.
Right.
That happened because Howard Shore, who is has, I think composed all the movies, all the scores for David's movies, and is also maybe best known for his work on, say, Lord of the Rings and other big epics. But Howard got commissioned by LA Opera to write an opera, and I do a lot of opera libretti, and we kind of knew each other, so we started talking about things to do, and we decided to do The Fly because it's kind of fascinating to do. I mean, nobody thinks about like a science fiction opera, but actually The Fly has a lot of big kind of sex and death themes that work well in opera. And once we decided to do that, then Howard asked David if he wanted to direct the opera version, which he did, and we premiered it at the Châtelet in Paris, and then it went to LA Opera.
Yeah, on that subject, I'd like to pivot to your work as a librettist and a musical writer. I read that your mom was a pianist and that you played violin when you were in high school. So musicality seems like it was a big part of your early life. Did you always know that you wanted to write for musicals, or was it something that sort of emerged later on in life?
No, I mean, when I first started writing plays, I was part of that mentality that like look down on Broadway, look down on musicals, it was commercial crap. So no, I never thought I was going to do that. But as you say, I did grow up with a lot of music. My sister became a cellist. I was a classical violinist, but then I started improvising in college and was actually much better as a jazz violinist than as a classical violinist. So I'm comfortable around music, and from my earliest plays, I've always incorporated what was in the 70s called theatricalism, sort of an explicit theatricality that often involves things like dance and music and in my case, Chinese opera tropes. So Butterfly, when it opened on Broadway, was kind of, it was perceived as musical-like in the way that something like Warhorse is perceived as musical-like. And I also spent a lot of time in Butterfly rehearsals listening to Puccini.
Right.
So I started to become a fan of opera. And then Philip Glass asked me to work on a show with him in the late 80s, which became 1,000 Airplanes on the Roof, a musical theater piece about alien abduction. And at this point, Philip and I have written 5 operas together. We just opened our 5th opera last month at Malmo Opera in Sweden, called Circus Days and Nights. So I just started working in a lot of musical theater forms, and then I wanted to adapt Flower Drum Song because I thought, Flower Drum Song is the only, before 2016, Flower Drum Song was the only show in Broadway history about Asian Americans. Like any play, any musical, like even in Butterfly, like it's not really about Asian Americans.
Right.
So Flower Drum Song was it until 2016. And it seemed sad that that musical had been lost. So I wanted to rewrite it. And then that led to Disney offering me to rewrite the Elton John, Tim Rice musical, Aida. And then we worked together on Tarzan. And now I have sort of a musical career as well, and wrote a personal musical, Soft Power, a couple of years ago with Janine Tesori.
Yeah, let's talk about Soft Power. Well, actually, maybe we should start with the sort of, if you're comfortable talking about it, the quite traumatic event that sort of weaves its way into Soft Power, which happened in, I think, late 2015. And I remember it, like the word rippling around Columbia when it happened. It was the most shocking, insane event. Yeah, are you okay to talk about it?
Sure. Because of all the recent spike in anti-Asian hate attacks, I've started to refer to myself as an OG Asian hate attack survivor, because it happened to me a little earlier. But I was walking on my block in Brooklyn one night, just around 9 p.m. on a Sunday, and I was carrying some groceries. And I felt like something hit me hard in the back of my head. And I turned, I saw some shadowy figure running away. I said, "What the fuck?" And then I figured I wasn't going to chase after him, so I just keep walking home. But then I found I couldn't walk straight, and I veered first into a parked car, then into a wall, and I put my hand up to where I'd been hit and came away covered with blood. And that's when I realized I'd been stabbed. So we live about 2 blocks away from Brooklyn Hospital. So I walked home, I dropped off the groceries. I realized that once I put my hand up and put pressure on the wound, then I could walk straight. And but I thought I should just keep walking. I walked to the hospital. My wife and daughter caught up with me and got to the emergency room and said, "Oh, I think I'm going to faint now," and did. And then I guess my daughter tells me I went into convulsions, and turned out that my attacker had severed my vertebral artery, and I'd lost about 1/3 of my blood. Yeah, but then I was out in like 2 or 3 days, and I was fine. At the time, we have an assemblyman here in New York named Ron Kim, who called a press conference to denounce anti-Asian hate and violence back then. But I wasn't really ready to accept that I'd been the victim of a hate attack, because the police didn't say it was a hate attack. And so I think it ended up working its way into this musical soft power, because when I was writing the first draft, I got to a certain point, I just started writing about my stabbing. And I thought, this is never going to stay in the show. This is just something I need to process. But it ended up being kind of a pivotal event in the structure of the musical. So I think the musical allowed me to begin processing what had happened to me. And there's a character in it who, a DHH autobiographical character, who is able to claim that he was the victim of a hate attack. And then I think I personally started to be comfortable saying that after the massacre in Georgia this past year. And I realized, oh wait, police never say anything as a hate attack. Like the mass murderers, like, no, I wasn't a racist. And everyone's like, oh, okay, I guess he wasn't a racist. So I think there's a certain amount of shame, oddly, that I associate with being the victim of a racist attack. And I think it's important to get over that. Right. And for us to be able to talk about it and share our stories and, be loud and advocate.
Yeah.
Which kind of got us off on a tangent.
No, but I guess it's also part of this sort of like the acceptability politics of being Asian American and the sort of erasure of the Asian American experience, that these hate crimes aren't really referred to as such. And I think it's really interesting that it kind of took you writing about it and processing it through making art about it, and then even much later for you to sort of come to grips with the fact that it actually was a hate crime. Yeah, and I think this theme of you like writing or like playing with autobiography in your work, sort of processing difficult events and trauma in your own work through sort of playing on it, is something that is a recurrent theme for you and has kind of persisted throughout your career. I'm interested to know like how you psychologically square up your like DHH analogs that often come up in your work from your actual self.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think all of us who are writers write autobiographical situations or characters. We just don't usually name them after ourselves. And I think part of the whole trick of being a writer is that you hide in plain sight. That you put the details of your breakup into the story, but nobody necessarily knows that that part of it is true. And I also think autobiographical characters are difficult because it's hard to get any distance on yourself. So even in, an amazing example like Glass Menagerie, one could argue that Tom is less well developed than the other characters.
Right.
And I found not initially with Soft Power, but with an earlier play, Yellowface, that once I decided to name the character after myself, paradoxically, I then felt compelled to make stuff up about him. Because again, it's like once you say it's me, then I'm like, well, I don't want to tell everybody the whole truth. Like I'm hiding in plain sight, and therefore, it was easier to give him the qualities that dramaturgically any character needs to have in terms of an arc, in terms of growth, flaws, all those things. So it's this kind of interesting balance between trying to make, like when we adapt things, we say, if you adapt something from one medium to another, you're trying to get the truth of it, the core of it, even though you don't necessarily keep all the details. You may change a lot of details. And I think it's the same when I'm writing about these DHH characters, which I've now done twice, and I don't know if I intend to do it again, but it's trying to extract an essence of truth by being open to making up things that are not true.
Right. And it's interesting that in calling those characters by your own name, it actually gives you the artistic license to then embellish on them. I think it's it's paradoxical, but it's kind of brilliant. Let's talk about Yellowface for a bit, because it recently had its first Australian production. A bunch of
yay.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of amazing. A bunch of enterprising young Asian Australian theater makers decided that they were going to put on a production of it. And it was amazing. I'd never seen a production of that play. I'd read it, obviously, and it's incredible how urgent and timely and resonant it still feels in terms of its conversation about casting and identity. But yeah, I wondered if you would talk about the sort of the real events that inspired that play and how you got from like face value to Yellowface.
So Yellowface is arguably the play with the longest gestation period of the ones that I've written, because it essentially comes about as a result of the casting controversy over the casting of Jonathan Pryce as the Eurasian pimp in the musical Miss Saigon when it initially comes to Broadway in 1991. And this led to a Yellowface protest that was quite widely covered in the national and international media and became a sort of early culture wars battle. And I was one of the voices advocating against the casting of Jonathan Pryce, and was kind of amazed at the amount of vitriol that was directed at us. It was obviously before social media, so we weren't being attacked on Twitter, but in some sense it was worse, I would argue, to be canceled in the age of mainstream media because there are only a limited number of outlets and there aren't a lot of competing voices. And I still believe today, by the way, that the most significant canceling only takes place when traditional media jumps on that bandwagon, but that's another issue. So as everybody knows, Jonathan Pryce did end up playing the part. And I felt I needed to process all that and wrote a play called Face Value, which was my follow-up to M. Butterfly, which was a farce of mistaken racial identity. Because I wanted to explore this idea, to what extent do we perform race? What does it mean to play another race? Do we play our own race? Do we perform our own racial identity in essence? And because it was right after M. Butterfly, everybody was very anxious to put it on Broadway, even though it was like a Feydeau, Joe Orton-like farce, which are really hard to write. So I initially, when I showed my producer the first draft, I was like, we really need to do like a couple of developmental productions of this. But then everyone was like, no, we're just taking it to Broadway. So I was like, okay, I can fix it in, 2 months. And I couldn't. And it was a huge flop. And it closed in previews on Broadway, which means that my producers were Stuart Oster, who produced on Butterfly, and Scott Rudin
Oh my God.
in his first Broadway show. And we all, decided, let's just close it. So we closed it.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just imagine the pressure that you must have felt after the sort of staggering critical and commercial success that was M Butterfly to write a follow-up and then to have it close in previews. I can't imagine how upsetting and traumatic that must have been. And also but obviously the way that you then chose to deal with it was to write a play about it, which I find kind of amazing.
Yeah, well, one of the nice things about, it was horrible. Actually, right after it closed, I went to Australia.
Oh, really?
Because the production of M Butterfly, produced by a guy named Harry Miller, was opening. So I escaped to Melbourne and Sydney. Anyway, but yeah, it was terrible. And then, I didn't die. And so in a way, that bursting of that expectation bubble was sort of a silver lining. Yeah, it would have been nicer to have had a hit, but you can keep going, whatever happens. So I kept thinking for many subsequent years, this idea of a farce of mistaken racial identity is a good idea. And then someplace in the early aughts, a few people started putting me into their movies, short films playing satirized versions of myself. And I thought, oh, I could do that. And I've, been watching probably Curb Your Enthusiasm too much. And so I started thinking about doing this subject, but as a kind of stage mockumentary. And I figured that it would begin and end with 2 real life events. One would be the protest against Jonathan Pryce. And then the one at the end would be the accusations against my father, who my father was an immigrant from Shanghai who founded the first federally chartered Asian American bank in the US. And the New York Times in the late 90s accused my father of laundering money for China. So I felt like there was a relationship between these 2 things, between this, the alleged criminalization of being a perpetual foreigner as an Asian American that my father experienced, and then the erasure, cultural erasure that the Yellowface casting represented. I wouldn't have been able to articulate it that way when I first started, but I felt like there was a relationship between these 2 things. And so I ended up writing Yellowface, and it is a sort of farce. If you think about farce as that the audience knows more than the characters do. So in a traditional farce, we in the audience know that the mistress is hiding in the closet, but the characters don't know that. And the comedy comes from watching the characters try to conceal that. And similarly, in Yellowface, there's an Asian American playwright named DHH who protests the casting of Jonathan Pryce and then inadvertently casts a white actor as the Asian lead in his own follow-up called Face Value, because he believes that this actor is of mixed race. And when DHH finds out that he's actually cast just a white guy, he tries to cover up that fact to protect his reputation as an Asian American role model. So that's a farcical premise. It's just told, in the case of Yellowface, through a mockumentary rather than through an Orton-esque Feydeau-like farce.
Right, yeah, it's interesting. It's a very clean classical farce structurally in a lot of ways. It is this sort of effete comedy of errors that is about these sort of unraveling disasters and the DHH analog going to increasingly extreme lengths to like cover up his initial mistake. But the play takes a really like surprising turn in the second act. And when I was watching it, it made me think about like, do you have a sense when you start writing something of what the structure is going to be, or do you sort of find it through the writing of that first draft?
So I generally like to know basically where I'm beginning and where I'm ending. So, and I compare it to like going on a road trip. So I know I'm going to drive from New York to Boston, but I don't know how I'm going to get there. Wow. And finding the path is the analog to writing the play. And that, for me, strikes the right balance between giving me enough freedom to, if I'm going to extend this metaphor, you know, oh, I want to stop in Providence. Right. But I know eventually I have to get to Boston, so I don't get completely off track. Right. And yeah, as I said, I knew I was going to end with the charges against my father. So I think the fact that the play ends up being a lot about the father and son, and that becomes kind of the emotional through line through the play, that I didn't know, or I wasn't conscious of when I began writing, but it is a bit implied by that beginning and ending. Right.
That's really interesting. The other thing that the play made me think about was it sort of dramatizes the inherent contradiction and innate tension of like trying to be an artist and an activist simultaneously, which I think is often more of a struggle for artists of color, where you sort of have no choice but to advocate for your own community. And I was wondering, you know, like particularly in the past 2 years with this sort of spike of anti-Asian hate crimes, and I know that you've been doing a lot of sort of advocacy, and you always have been like an activist and really spoken for your community. How do you balance those two impulses, to be sort of like a pure artist and then also to be an activist?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, there's not really a contradiction because, as I was saying earlier, with Sam and Irene, Sam Shepard and Irene Furness, I discovered myself as an Asian American through my writing. Right. And therefore, the two have always been inherently linked for me. And then once I knew I was going to be writing about Asian American subjects, I started studying more Asian American history, whatever there was to read at that time, and engaging with an Asian American movement, which was just in a kind of nascent form. But at that point, was very enmeshed with what was called third world solidarity, with the struggles of Black people, brown people, indigenous people. It was Asian Americans progressive Asian America had not been sort of split off yet into this kind of model minority trope that then became dominant over the past 20 or 30 years. And the silver lining, I hope, on the anti-Asian attacks is that the community realizes that the model minority trope doesn't serve us, but accommodating racism does not ameliorate it. And the society can turn on a dime, and anytime there's any tension between, in my case, in the US, and any Asian nation, the country turns on Asian Americans. And so it's more incumbent to, I think, go back to that earlier 70s model and feel solidarity with other BIPOC people, other people of color whose interest in battling white supremacy is similarly self-interested.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's interesting that we are seeing a return to that discourse around intersectionality as it exists in like present sort of multi-ethnic activism. I'm wary of the time that we have left, so I'm gonna try and power through more questions. I'm interested to actually know, and this is like just a very selfish question because I'm starting to write a lot of screenwriting, and it's very different. And I'm wondering how you have found working on TV, how you found working with showrunners and other writers, and what your experience was like working on The Affair. Do you enjoy it? Do you like screenwriting?
I do. I feel like I've only become good at it, to be honest, in the last few years, because it is really different. And I think working on The Affair, like we talked about the M. Butterfly movie experience and the fact that I wasn't on set, I wasn't in the editing room. So often as a screenwriter, you're not consulted once you turn in the script.
Right.
For movies. But for television, because we produced our own episodes, we had to be on set. I didn't always like being on set, but I learned so much. And I think that made me a much better screenwriter and television writer. In the case of The Affair, it was created by Sarah Treem, a playwright who was my mentee. And I mentored her through her first production at Off-Broadway Playwrights Horizons, and then we just became really close. So she became my boss, and that was a really good experience. I thought it's not unlike teaching, because teaching, you're trying to help your students make better versions of what it is they've created, and that's what it's like to work in somebody else's writer's room. I'm also working on creating a show myself right now, so I feel that I learned enough during my 4 years on The Affair that I can try to bring my own sensibility to television now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And getting that hands-on experience of producing the episode yourself, I'm sure it sets you up to feel like, oh, actually I can confidently run a room and be a showrunner and deal with the logistical side of filmmaking as well as the creative side of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and I love that metaphor of it being similar to teaching, because it does often feel like if you're in a room with other writers, you're doing dramaturgy, you're trying to find a version of their story and the best mechanism to tell it.
Yeah.
How has your teaching experience been over the past, during the pandemic? I'm really interested to know what Columbia has been doing through this period.
Yeah, it's been hard. I think writers had it relatively easier because we can at least get actors on Zoom, and it's not a perfect platform by any means, but you can hear the play and you can give notes on the play. For directors and actors, it's a lot harder, and Columbia gave the actors in particular an extra year and pushed back all of the thesis productions, the full productions that we do for writers at the end of every the 3 years, so that we now have a backlog of the last, the class of 2020, 21, and 22 are all having their thesis plays performed in the summer of 22.
Oh my God. It's going to be incredible. It'll be like a huge festival of plays.
Yeah, I'm probably not going on vacation in the summer of 22.
Yeah, no, you're going to be doing a lot of teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to finish off by asking you, I certainly, even though I wasn't in your playwriting classes, in the limited time that I got, I think you told me in collab, maybe that was the only class that I actually took with you.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but I really appreciated your generosity as a teacher. And throughout my early career as well, you were very generous with sharing my play with people and giving me notes. And I guess I just wondered, what you hope to impart to not just your students, but the next generation of theater makers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's exciting is to find somebody like you, and I wish you had been in my classes more now so I could say you were, but somebody who is true to their own voice, and it's a voice, particularly if it's a voice and perspective that we haven't seen so much, and also has enough craft and discipline to be able to actually manifest a good version of what it is they want to make, and which, you know, you clearly fall into that category. So what I would say to people who in general want to write is I like to, you know, the thing that makes you strange, the thing that makes you different, the thing that makes you weird, that's actually your superpower as a writer and as an artist. And that is not only going to make the experience of writing a play more meaningful for you, it is probably going to make you more saleable also, because that's what everybody's looking for now. Everybody's looking for strong original voices, not only in the theater, but even in television. And so write the thing that means something to you.
Wow, I think that's both like brilliant artistic advice and brilliant career advice. And yeah, I was wondering what you feel about, like, I think we've seen a really big body of work, of which you have been part of, evolving sort of like Asian American narratives, from really tackling sort of like the immigrant experience to, I think, broader macrocosmic plays about, you know, a lot of your plays have dealt with sort of like Sino-American relations and different ideas of democracy in those two countries and their intersection. What do you think the next wave of like Asian American playwriting is going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, or else I would probably try to write it. And I also feel that the beauty of it is that it's going to come from an experience and from artists who think of things that I couldn't think of.
Right.
So, I mean, if I had to guess, I feel like I would love to see, and this has to do with the kind of intersectionality that we talked about and third world unity and all that. I mean, I would love to see more work by Asian Americans that can engage with other BIPOC communities. Like, we're pretty good. There's a lot of work out there now about Asians and white people. And I hope we can move beyond that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it does feel like it's still kind of siloized, you know, like there's a lot of sort of minority group playwrights who are writing about the experience of their own racial identity, but less so the intersection of multiple minority groups. So yeah, I agree. I feel like that would be a really amazing place for it to evolve towards. What are you working on now? What are you excited about now that the pandemic is sort of, at least it looks like, cresting a sort of new normalcy, at least in New York?
Yeah, New York, things are looking pretty good at the moment. Gosh, I'm working a bunch of things. We're doing a new version of Soft Power, a post 2020 version, which we have, you know, strong commercial producers. We intend to bring back to New York, fingers crossed, Broadway, which focuses less on relitigating the 2016 election, but more about the current crisis of democracy and the role of AAPIs in it. Then, yeah, I'm creating a new television series for Netflix. And then I have a movie that I just signed, but I can't really talk about right now.
Okay, got it. Well, that sounds really exciting. And I'm so glad that Soft Power is going to get another run. And again, I am shocked that, given its staggering artistic success, you're like willing to go back and rewrite it again.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it really speaks to your willingness to continually re-examine, reinvestigate the themes of your work and try and, you know, make them as urgent and contemporaneous as you possibly can.
Yeah, and make them sort of speak to me today, whatever today is.
Yeah. And do you feel like, are you doing that for your audience, or are you doing that for yourself?
It's usually both. I mean, I have to want to do it for myself first, and then we can see if anybody wants to go along with me.
Yeah. With a tiny bit of time left, I do just want to touch on your collaboration with Lee Silverman, who I assume is gonna do the next Soft Power again. And you worked with Lee a couple of times, right?
Yeah, Lee and I have probably worked together on 6 or 7 shows now. We met on Yellowface. And before that, I kind of hopped around from director to director. I was fairly promiscuous. And then I was just settled down in middle age.
What about Lee's direction do you like?
There's a couple things. I mean, I don't think I'm particularly visual. I'm not one of these playwrights who can see the thing. And so I need someone with a good visual sense. I think she has a really keen dramaturgical sense. And so as a partner on a work that we're developing, a work that I'm rewriting during rehearsals and during previews, she's incredibly helpful. And she's just willing to go places that I'll just make these impossible assignments, like with Chinglish. Oh, we're going to do sort of Glengarry Glen Ross, but it's going to be a comedy and it's going to be a third in Mandarin. And we're going to use surtitles. And she's like, great. Or Soft Power. Well, we're going to create we want to create a Rodgers and Hammerstein-like musical in its sincerity, put it in a frame that is ironic. And so that the audience both feels it, but also is critiquing their own feelings. Just these kind of impossible assignments.
Right, that she's like really game for.
Yeah.
If the people watching this want to engage with your work, I mean, it's kind of difficult for people to get over to New York and see Soft Power, but they can read your plays. Give us your best DHH syllabus. Like, what should young playwrights start with?
Oh, wow. Well, thanks. I mean, I think, particularly if you're a playwright, it might be interesting to read both versions of M. Butterfly. Because I happen to think the new one's better, but you can judge for yourself and you can sort of see the changes, and it's an interesting exercise for a writer. Other than that, probably, I think Yellowface is worth reading. Soft Power hasn't been published yet because I'm rewriting it. So, you can
listen to the cast recording, right?
Yes, the cast recording you can find on Spotify or any place. Maybe FOB or Dance on the Railroad, like 2 of the earlier plays from the Joe Papp period.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's actually, I think that's a really great syllabus. Start with M. Butterfly and then work your way back to FOB. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me, David. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. And I hope that I can actually get over to New York next year and finally see you in person. Oh, maybe see some of this insane festival of plays that Columbia is going to do next year.
Yeah. You can just come any day in the summer of 22, and there will be a Columbia Thesis Playwrights production on.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay.